The vote was not even close. I sat in the back row of the observation gallery and watched 14 alien delegates raise their signal lights, pale blue, the color the Accord used for rejection, and I felt something in my chest go very quiet. Not broken, not angry. Just quiet, the way a fire goes quiet when the last of the air is finally gone. 31 years. That was how long humanity had been sitting in that gallery, in those back rows, watching other species make decisions about a galaxy we helped hold together. 31 years of provisional status, of observer credentials that expired every 4 cycles, and had to be renewed with paperwork and waiting and careful, diplomatic patience. 31 years of being told we were not quite ready, not quite stable, not quite what the Interstellar Accord needed in a full voting member. 14 lights. Blue. No. Ambassador Yara Solen did not flinch. I had worked beside her for 9 years, and in that time I had never seen her flinch at anything. She was a small woman with short gray hair and the kind of posture that made rooms feel smaller around her. She sat at the human delegation table on the floor of the Grand Conclave, completely still, and she let the silence last exactly long enough for every delegate in that chamber to feel the full weight of what had just happened. Then she reached up, unclipped her translation earpiece, and set it on the table in front of her. She did not slam it. She did not make a speech. She set it down with the precise, deliberate care of someone placing the final piece in a puzzle they had already decided to walk away from. The small click of it against the obsidian table surface was the only sound in a chamber built to hold 10,000 voices. My name is Callum Ward. I was 26 when I first arrived at Conclave Station as a junior attaché, optimistic in the way only young diplomats can be, convinced that the right words in the right order could solve anything, fix anything, bridge any distance between any two thinking creatures who were willing to sit across a table from each other. I was 57 now. I had learned that some things do not want to be fixed. Some things want to be ended. I watched Solen stand up from her chair. Around her, the rest of the human delegation did the same, all 11 of them. Together, without a single word passing between them, they pushed their chairs back, gathered their materials, and stood. The Threll first speaker, a tall, pale creature named Counselor Veth, whose species communicated emotion primarily through color shifts in their throat membranes, turned a very faint shade of yellow. In Threll body language, yellow meant surprise. It also meant, I had learned over years of close study, that they were reconsidering something they had believed was already settled. Good. Let him reconsider. Solen spoke once. Her voice carried without effort in that enormous chamber, clear and unhurried, the way a person speaks when they have decided the words are a formality, the decision already made. The human delegation invokes Accord Clause 7 Omega, she said, voluntary and total cessation of participation. Effective in 72 standard hours, all human personnel, contractors, diplomats, and attached staff will begin full withdrawal from all Accord-controlled space. We thank the Council for 31 years of consideration. She picked up her bag. She walked to the exit. The delegation followed her, one by one, in a line so orderly and unhurried, it looked almost like a procession. No rushing, no visible emotion, no parting shots, just 11 human beings walking out of the most powerful chamber in the known galaxy, the same way you leave a meeting that no longer requires your presence. I was not in the delegation. I was in the back row of the gallery with a data pad in my hand and a credential badge around my neck that said, Human Observer in 3 languages. I stood up anyway, without quite deciding to. Nobody stopped me. Nobody said anything at all. I walked out of the Grand Conclave of the Interstellar Accord, and behind me, 14 blue lights were still glowing on the voting board. In the corridor outside, Solen was already moving toward the embassy section with her team around her. I fell into step beside her deputy, a man named Owen Dale, who had been with the human delegation even longer than I had. Owen was tall and thin, and wore the permanent expression of someone who had delivered bad news so consistently over so many years that his face had simply settled into it as a default. She is really doing it, I said. She already did it, Owen said. The moment she set down the earpiece, the decision was made. Everything else is logistics now. I glanced back at the conclave doors, through which I could already hear the chamber erupting, the overlapping frequencies and tones of 17 species talking at once. The specific sound of people who had just realized the script they were following had gone in a direction they had not planned for. They think we are bluffing, I said. Owen looked at me with the patient expression he reserved for statements of the obvious. I know, he said. That is exactly what I am counting on them thinking. I did not fully understand what he meant until later. At the time, I walked with them through the gleaming corridors of Conclave Station, past the food vendors and the courier terminals and the small meditation gardens the Keth delegation maintained near the East Wing, and I thought about 31 years. I thought about every human who had ever sat in that gallery, in those back rows, watching other species vote on their future as though it were a matter of administrative procedure, rather than something that belonged to the people it concerned. I thought about a woman named Pita Ngozi, whom I had read about in a history file years earlier, a human engineer who had spent her entire career developing the mathematical navigation framework that now powered the Threll shipping network, the most extensive cargo transit system in the known accord. She had died at 43, in a provisional observer posting, having never received a single commendation from the organization whose infrastructure ran on her work, because her research had been filed under the institutional credit of the Accord run station she worked at. Her name was in the footnotes if you knew to look. Most people did not know to look. I thought about the frontier medical stations in the outer sectors, the ones running with skeleton crews because no other species would volunteer for the atmospheric conditions, the long rotations, the isolation, and the pay scales that barely covered the cost of transport. Human volunteers filled those positions. Human volunteers had always filled those positions. I thought about the Accord's border patrol on the Keth frontier, the patrols that functioned at all because human crew members could sustain high alert performance on shortened sleep cycles, could tolerate the neurological pressure of extended threat assessments without the kind of cognitive degradation that would sideline a Vaughn or a Threll within a standard week. The Accord had never officially noted this as a staffing consideration. The staffing records simply showed the numbers, and the numbers had always worked out the way they worked out. I thought about all of it, every piece of it, and I felt that quiet thing in my chest go still and deep, like an anchor finding the bottom of a very cold sea. At the embassy, preparation was already underway. People were removing credentials from walls, boxing personal items, powering down terminals in an orderly sequence. There was no panic, no raised voices, no visible distress. There was a focused, methodical calm that I found almost unsettling in its efficiency, as though everyone had been quietly ready for this for a long time and had simply been waiting for the signal that it was finally time to move. I went to my own office at the edge of the human embassy complex. It was not much of an office. A desk, a chair, a window that looked out over the station's main docking arm. I had spent 9 years looking at that view, ships coming in, ships departing, the slow rotation of the station's outer ring against a fixed field of stars. I took my credential badge off my jacket and looked at it for a while. Human observer. The laminate was worn at the corners from years of daily use. I had renewed it 8 times over 9 years. Every 4 cycles, I had filled out the paperwork, submitted the renewal, waited for approval, and clipped the new badge to my jacket, and gone back to my desk in the back row of the gallery. I set the badge on the desk. I stood at the window for a long time, watching the docking arm below. Down there, I could already see the first human transport ships beginning their pre-departure sequences. Small lights blinking on in the dark, running checks, preparing to leave. They moved with quiet precision, like everything else that was happening right now. Somewhere in the station behind me, 14 blue lights were still glowing on the conclave board. I turned away from the window. I picked up my bag. I left the badge on the desk, next to a coffee mug with a chip in the rim that I had meant to replace for 2 years and never had. We began to pack. We began to leave. I thought, walking out of that office for the last time, that I should feel more than I did. Rage, or grief, or relief, or some combination of all 3 that would at least feel proportional to 31 years of accumulated weight. What I felt instead was a clean, simple certainty, the feeling of a person who has made a decision they know is correct, even if the correctness of it will take time to become visible to anyone else. The Accord, I thought, would understand very soon. I was right. I was just slightly wrong about how soon. The transport ship was called the Hartwell, and it smelled like recycled air and coffee, which meant it smelled exactly like every human vessel I had ever been on in 3 decades of interstellar work. I had a bunk in the lower deck beside a porthole that gave me a narrow view of Conclave Station falling slowly behind us, and on the first night I lay there in the dark and wrote in my journal, because my mind would not slow down enough for sleep. Day 1, I wrote. The council has not called. I had known they would not. Not yet. They had 14 blue votes and 31 years of institutional certainty, and a probability model that I happen to know put the likelihood of human reversal at 94.7% within 36 hours. I knew about the probability model because a Keth systems analyst named Commander Voss Ree, with whom I had worked on a border logistics project 3 years earlier, had quietly transmitted a copy of the council's internal communications to my personal channel before the Hartwell left the dock. Voss Ree was not supposed to do that. She had done it anyway, with a 2-sentence note attached. I am not doing this because I am disloyal to the Accord. I am doing this because the Accord is being spectacularly foolish, and I believe someone should have clear visibility of exactly how foolish. I had read the council's internal channel logs on my bunk with the lights turned down low, and felt something move through me that was not quite amusement, and not quite despair. A specific mixture of both, the emotional state produced by watching powerful people be confidently wrong in ways they cannot yet perceive. Councillor Veth had told his deputy, the morning after the withdrawal announcement, that the situation was a tantrum with a deadline. The Vaughn Collective's diplomatic AI had classified it as low-probability disruption in their internal status system. The Renan Trade Council had circulated a memo noting that, based on historical precedent from a human labor action in 2287 that had lasted 4 days, they expected the situation to resolve before the end of the current cycle. They were using the wrong historical precedent. In 2287, the humans involved had been asking for better pay and safer equipment on a specific set of mining contracts. Those were solvable problems. The Accord had eventually improved both conditions, and the workers had returned, because the problem had a solution that fit within the existing structure. This situation was different in a fundamental way that the Accord's analysts had not grasped. There was no solution that fit within the existing structure, because the existing structure was itself the problem. But they did not know that yet. They were still watching the deadline with calm confidence, waiting for humans to blink. I put away the communications logs and watched the stars through the porthole and tried to sleep. I managed a few hours before my mind pulled me back. On the first full day aboard, I started a list in the back pages of my journal. Names. Humans I knew of, from records and reports and conversations over the years, who had done significant work in Accord space, and had never been properly credited for it. I started with the ones I knew best. The list grew faster than I expected. I had to start a second page. On the second day of travel, the first reports began filtering through the public Accord communications network, the civilian channels that anyone with a relay receiver could access. A medical station in the Kelvar Reach sector had filed an emergency resource request. A border patrol sector on the Keth frontier had reported reduced coverage capacity. A navigation maintenance crew on the Threll shipping corridor had flagged a calibration overdue notice that they were not currently staffed to address. None of these were described as human departure consequences in the public reports. They were described as operational adjustments and temporary staffing transitions. But I had been reading Accord communications long enough to know the shape of things, and the shape of these things was a system discovering, piece by piece, that what it had treated as ordinary background infrastructure was in fact a load-bearing structure that required specific people to maintain it. People who were no longer there. Voss Ree sent me a brief update on the second day, flagged personal rather than through official channels. The tone in the council's private communications, she said, had shifted slightly from the previous day. The phrase she used was, "They are beginning to ask questions they did not ask before." She did not elaborate, but she did not need to. I had been in enough rooms where confident institutions began encountering their own blind spots to know exactly what that kind of shift felt like from the inside. The Hartwell stopped briefly at a transit relay station called Holman Point on the third day, where we found several other human ships converging before the longer jump back toward Earth. A small research vessel docked beside us, and I went to the common area of the relay station while we were there. The research team was sitting together at a cluster of tables, still in their field gear, with the particular silence of people who have been pulled away from something they cared about before it was finished. I sat near enough to hear their conversation without meaning to intrude. They had been midway through an excavation on a methane atmosphere world, a site that early scans suggested might be the remnants of a pre-Accord civilization, something that would have been an enormous scientific discovery if they had been able to complete the work. They had left their tools in the ground because extraction protocol required leaving the site as intact as possible for future work. The data they had gathered was with them. The site itself was there, waiting. One of them, a young man named Daniel Pierce, who could not have been more than 30 and who still had dried field dust on his jacket sleeve, was telling the others that the atmospheric conditions at the site were going to make it impossible for a non-adapted team to continue the work without full environmental suits, and that the suits currently available to the Accord's Science Directorate limited manual dexterity to about 60% of what the excavation required. "So nothing gets done until we go back," one of the others said. Daniel looked at his coffee. "Nothing gets done," he agreed. Nobody at that table said anything for a while. Not because they were angry, I thought, but because they were calculating. The way people who care about their work always calculate when they are forced to step away from it. How long the delay would be, what the delay would cost, whether the thing they were working toward would still be there when they were allowed to return. I left them to their conversation and sent a short message to Vasri before we departed the relay. 3 days out, no contact from the council. She replied before we cleared the relay station's signal range. "They are not contacting you. They are contacting each other. The tone is different from what it was 2 days ago. I am telling you this because I believe it will matter to you." It did matter. I tucked the information away and thought about it for the rest of the journey. The Hartwell's comms officer let me know on the 4th day that Conclave Station's Human Embassy section had gone completely dark. The last personnel to leave had been a communications coordinator named Diane Price, who had sent a brief note to the general human staff channel before sealing the doors. "Lights off. Doors locked. See you somewhere better." I read that in my bunk and felt the full weight of it settle in. 9 years of my life had happened in that embassy. My first real posting, my longest posting, the posting where I had learned the most and argued hardest, and stayed longest when everyone else went home for the season. Lights off now. Doors locked. I wrote in my journal until the words started repeating themselves, then put it away, and looked at the porthole, and the stars moving past it in the slow, indifferent way stars always move, and I thought about what it meant to leave a place not in defeat, but in the clearest-eyed decision you had ever made. It did not feel like losing. It did not even feel like winning. It felt like the first honest breath after a very long time of careful breathing. On the 5th day, we crossed into Sol system space, and I could see Earth growing in the porthole, blue and small, and impossibly familiar after so many years away. I pressed my hand against the glass without quite deciding to. Below it, everything was waiting. The assessment teams, the analysis, the slow, patient work of documenting what we had done and what it was worth, and what the Accord was going to be asked to acknowledge before any of us went back. The council still had not called. But according to Vasri's last message, the questions they were asking each other had stopped sounding confident and had started sounding afraid. Good. Let them be afraid for a while. Some lessons require a certain quality of fear before they take hold. Nobody had ever actually counted what we did. That was the part that stopped me, over and over, as I sat in the briefing room at the Strategic Analysis Division building outside Geneva and watched Francis Archer walk through a presentation assembled from 6 weeks of careful, exhaustive research. Francis was a senior analyst, the kind of person who communicated almost entirely through data and found the experience of having to add emotional framing to her presentations mildly exasperating. She was in her late 40s, precise in her speech, and she had the rare gift of being able to present numbers that were genuinely shocking, without her own voice giving away how shocked she was. This made her briefings feel more devastating than if she had been visibly upset, because her calm forced you to sit with the numbers without a performance to distract you. She put the first figure on the screen and said nothing for a moment. Just let it be there. 61%. That was the share of successful Accord frontier expansion missions in the past 3 decades that had depended on human pioneer teams operating in environments officially classified under the Accord's own safety ratings as extreme risk or above. The other Accord member species had labor agreements that prohibited assigning their workers to extreme risk conditions without premium compensation, specialized equipment, and an exit option at the 30-day mark. Those agreements were the result of centuries of organized advocacy by their respective labor bodies, and the Accord honored them. Humans had no such agreements. We had been provisional observers, not full members. Provisional observers did not participate in the Accord's labor framework. The contracts human workers signed were issued under a separate provisional services structure, that had different, and notably lower, standards for what constituted acceptable working conditions. Francis showed me a side-by-side comparison. A Vaughan environmental technician deployed to a radiation-elevated site received a compensation rate of 340 standard units per cycle, specialized protective equipment funded entirely by the Accord, and a mandatory rotation limit of 45 days before a rest period was required. A human environmental technician deployed to the same class of site received 180 standard units per cycle, standard equipment, with an allowance for supplementary protection at personal cost, and no mandatory rotation limit. The human technician was also, she noted, statistically more likely to accept the posting in the first place, because human provisional workers had fewer alternative postings available to them, and because the frontier work, even underpaid and underprotected, was often the only option that offered any advancement opportunity at all. The word we kept finding in the files, Francis said, when we looked at why humans consistently accepted these postings, was available. They were available. The official records did not usually go further than that. But when we cross-referenced the available alternative postings at the time each worker signed their extreme risk contracts, the picture was clear. The options were worse in almost every case. The choice to accept frontier postings was technically voluntary. In practice, the voluntary nature of that choice was significantly constrained. For Quent. I wrote that down. I wrote down a lot of things in that room. Human reaction times under high-stress conditions were 40% faster than the Threl average, and significantly faster than every other Accord member species as well. This was a documented biological fact that the Accord's rapid response units had relied on for decades. The personnel composition of those units was, across the entire Accord military and emergency management structure, disproportionately human. Not officially, not as a stated policy, but in practice, in the way that things become facts through accumulation rather than through declaration. No Accord document had ever stated that human biological characteristics made humans particularly suitable for rapid response work. The assignments were recorded as voluntary specialization. The forms human workers had signed were marked with the word voluntary. Francis showed me 53 of those forms and then showed me the alternative postings that had been made available to each of those workers at the time of signing. 48 of the 53 had had worse alternatives in every measurable category. Human immune systems could adapt to atmospheric and biological environments that required full environmental sealing for most other species. This adaptation process was medically intensive, months of conditioning, real physical cost, documented side effects that required careful management. The Accord's frontier health protocols compensated Vaughan and Keth workers for analogous conditioning procedures at a rate that reflected the actual cost to the worker. The compensation rate for human workers undergoing the same class of procedure was lower. The policy document establishing that rate, Francis showed me, was from 2198 and had never been revised. The stated reasoning was that human immune biology was naturally suited to the process, and therefore the cost to the worker was assumed to be lower. Nobody had asked any human workers what the cost actually was. Francis moved through the presentation. Every section had the same basic shape, a capability that humans brought to Accord operations, a documentation of how that capability had been systematically used, a comparison of the compensation and recognition humans received relative to what other species received for comparable contributions, and then the gap, the exact quantified difference between what humans had put in and what they had received in return. The gaps, taken individually, were each defensible as the result of circumstance, policy inertia, and administrative oversight. Taken together, over 31 years, across every sector of Accord operations, they formed a picture that was not defensible as accident. It was the picture of a system that had found humans useful and had arranged things, gradually and without anyone sitting down to make a deliberate plan, so that humans would continue to be available for what the system needed them for. Then came Claire Osei. Francis put her name on the screen, and I recognized it from the list I had been keeping in the back pages of my journal, and something in me went very still. Claire Osei had arrived at Conclave Station in 2241 as a junior linguist on a provisional observer contract, 26 years old, from Accra. She had spent the next 17 years there. During that time, she had developed the phonological framework at the core of the Accord's universal translation system, the system that allowed 17 species with fundamentally incompatible vocal architecture, different auditory ranges, and radically different cognitive frameworks for processing meaning to communicate with each other in real time. This was not a small thing. Before her framework, real-time cross-species communication had required dedicated interpretation teams for each species pairing and still produced significant rates of semantic error. The translation quality in high-stakes negotiations was poor enough that several near conflicts in the preceding decades had been attributed in part to mistranslation. Her framework reduced cross-species communication error rates by over 80% within 5 years of deployment, and had been updated and refined continuously since then, always building on her original structure. The Accord's Universal Translator, as it was currently deployed across the entire known Accord territory, was Claire Osei's work. The patent was filed under the Conclave Linguistic Institute. The institute was an Accord body. Her name appeared in the research credits as a contributing analyst. She had never been promoted beyond provisional observer grade, because advancement to senior researcher designation required full member credentials that humans were not granted. She had returned to Earth in 2263, after 17 years. She had died in 2278. 48 years ago, every thinking being in the Accord had started talking through her work. They were still talking through it now. Most of them had no idea who she was. I sat with that for a long moment. Frances was watching me. She had learned, I think, in the preparation of this briefing, how to give people the time they needed with each piece. "We have 43 cases of comparable scale," she said. "That is only what we found in the first 3 weeks of searching. The analysis is not complete." I asked about the frontier stations. 14 medical stations were currently in crisis-level staffing situations. Of those 14, 12 had submitted formal emergency resource requests to the Accord's Central Coordination Office. All 12 requests had been acknowledged. None had received concrete responses with timelines, specific personnel assignments, or funding commitments. The Accord did not have replacement pools for those roles, because the volunteer infrastructure that filled them had been almost entirely human and had never needed to be supplemented. The Border Patrol situation had deteriorated further since the initial reports I had seen on the Hartwell. Coverage on the Keth frontier was now at 38% of the minimum safe operational threshold. The Accord had responded by rerouting 2 Corvette-class vessels into the patrol zone as a stopgap. The Corvettes were capable combat ships, but they were not patrol ships. They did not have the sensor configuration or the crew training for sustained patrol operations. They had been sent because there was nothing else available. I asked about the navigation calibration on the Threll corridor. Frances pulled up a secondary file. The calibration overdue notice I had seen on the public communications network had since escalated. 2 cargo transits had been delayed by navigational errors that would not have occurred if the calibration had been performed on schedule. The Accord's maintenance directorate had sent a team. The team had the equipment. They did not have the specific procedural knowledge that the human technicians who had previously managed that corridor had accumulated over years of hands-on experience. The calibration was being attempted but was significantly behind schedule. Then Frances showed me my own name. It appeared briefly, in a table midway through the section on diplomatic operations. A border incident from 7 years ago, involving 2 Accord member species in a territorial dispute that had been escalating for months, and had reached the point of armed standoff. A 6-day mediation conducted at a station on the edge of the conflict zone under conditions that the Accord's own safety assessment had rated as high risk. The mediation had succeeded. Both parties had withdrawn to their respective territories. The armed standoff had ended without engagement. The Accord's diplomatic record of the incident listed it as a successful resolution by the Joint Diplomatic Corps. My name was not in the record. I had conducted that mediation alone, because no other qualified personnel had been available at the distance and on the timeline required. I had been the only person in that room for 6 days. The record said Joint Diplomatic Corps. Frances did not comment on it. She moved to the next slide, and I let her, because the point was not me. The point was the 43 cases like Claire Osei, the 14 medical stations, the Border Patrol at 38%, the navigation calibration behind schedule, the excavation tools left in the ground on a methane atmosphere world. The point was the accumulated weight of all of it together, the full picture of what had been built on a foundation that the builders had never been properly acknowledged for laying. When the briefing ended, the other people in the room filed out quietly, and I stayed at the table for a while by myself. I looked at the data on the screen. I thought about what it meant to be essential to something that did not know you were essential. the specific texture of being necessary and invisible simultaneously, the weight of knowing that the weight you carried had never been named. I was not angry. I had moved through anger somewhere between Conclave Station and Holman Point, and come out the other side of it into something quieter and colder. Anger wanted a target. What I felt now was more like the feeling of having a diagnosis confirmed, the relief of clarity, the difficulty of knowing exactly what you are dealing with. I stood up and went outside into the Geneva afternoon. The Alps were visible in the distance, the same mountains that had been there before the Accord existed, before humanity reached the stars, before any of this. They were not concerned. I was grateful for that. I took out my journal. I added 17 names to the list in the back pages. Then I went back inside. There was work to do, and we were going to do it correctly. The council called the emergency session on a Tuesday, and in a decision so characteristic of the institution it was almost elegant, they did not invite us. I learned about it the same way I had been learning about council business since leaving Conclave Station, through Voss-Ree, who by this point I had stopped thinking of as a contact and started thinking of as someone I would call a friend, if the diplomatic conventions we both operated under allowed for that word without complication. She transmitted the transcript of the closed session to my personal channel, along with a note that read, "I am formally present in this recording. I am also formally disgusted by approximately 60% of it. Please read carefully and manage your expectations accordingly." I read it very carefully. Then I read it again. Then I set my comm down on my desk and looked at the wall for a moment, because there was a section in the middle of the transcript that required a period of quiet adjustment before I could continue thinking clearly about its contents. The session had opened with Councillor Veth delivering a prepared address, in which he proposed that humanity's withdrawal be formally declared a violation of provisional observer obligations under the Accord Charter. He had prepared a legal argument supporting this position. The argument cited 3 specific clauses. By the standards of Accord internal documentation, the preparation was thorough and the presentation was organized. A delegate from the Renan Trade Council, a methodical individual named Senior Representative Naure, whose species were known for their meticulous approach to procedural accuracy, had asked Councillor Veth to cite the specific charter text of each clause he had referenced. Veth had done so. Naure had read all 3 clauses aloud in their full original language. None of them contained language that prohibited a provisional observer from invoking voluntary exit under Clause 7 Omega. 2 of them were about reporting requirements for observers present during active Accord sessions. The third was about conflict of interest disclosure for observers serving on advisory committees. The Threll legal team had, it appeared, not recently reread the provisional observer agreement they were attempting to invoke. The transcript notation for the period following this exchange described it as extended procedural clarification, which was Accord diplomatic language for a dispute that had become uncomfortable. Reading between the institutional language, it sounded like an argument. After the procedural matters were temporarily set aside, a representative from the Vaughan Collective had put forward a proposal to send a formal delegation to Earth for direct talks. This proposal had been received with what the transcript called broad preliminary interest, which I had learned to translate as, everyone agreed the idea sounded reasonable, until the follow-up questions began, at which point the broad interest became considerably less broad. The follow-up questions included, who from the Accord would compose the delegation, what authority they would have to make offers on behalf of the Council, what specifically they would be authorized to offer, and whether the human delegation would even agree to receive them. Nobody had an answer for the last question. Nobody had asked. The Keth delegation spoke next. Voss-Ree was on the official speaker's record, which meant she had formally requested and been granted the floor, which meant her comments were on the permanent record and could not be edited or summarized away by the session archivist. She had spoken for 4 minutes. I read every word 3 times. She had not been polite in the diplomatic sense of polite. She had been direct in the way that Keth military officers were trained to be direct when they believed that softened language would obscure a situation that needed clarity. She had said, the human delegation has withdrawn, invoking a legal mechanism available to them under the Accord's own charter. Frontier station medical operations are failing. Border patrol coverage is below safe minimum threshold in 3 sectors. The navigation calibration situation on the Threll corridor is a developing technical problem with no current solution in the maintenance directorate's available staff. A xenoarchaeological site of potential historic significance is deteriorating because the team capable of working on it has departed, and no equivalent team exists. She had then said the thing that produced the 48-second silence. She had said, "These operational failures share a single cause. The Accord has treated humanity as a provisional labor resource for 31 years, rather than as equals entitled to full participation. The Accord has used human labor, human expertise, human biological adaptability, and human willingness to accept difficult conditions at rates of compensation and recognition that no full member species would have accepted. The Accord did not acknowledge this imbalance because the imbalance was convenient, and those most disadvantaged by it lacked the membership standing required to formally challenge it. The human delegation's withdrawal is not an operational irregularity. It is a consequence. The Council is now dealing with that consequence and will continue to deal with it until the underlying cause is addressed." Then she had asked whether the Council was prepared to address the underlying cause. The transcript noted 48 seconds of what it described as unscheduled pause. For a body that processed 17 simultaneous translation streams and ran on a tight session schedule, 48 seconds of nothing was extraordinary. I imagined the chamber. 17 delegations, all of them processing what had just been said on the record by a serving Keth commander who had not hedged a single word of it. Then the Council voted on whether to offer humanity full membership. Not provisional, not conditional, not a newly structured framework for enhanced observer engagement or an expanded consultation protocol. Full membership, with equal voting standing and full treaty rights. The thing the human delegation had formally requested in the first vote, 31 years ago. The vote was 9-8 against. I sat with that for a long time. The 9-8 margin, the fact that they had voted on it at all, which they had never done before, which meant something had shifted enough that the question could be raised and survive to a vote, and then the fact that the vote had failed, by a single position, because Councillor Veth had argued that granting membership under current circumstances would appear coerced. He was correct that it would appear coerced. He was refusing to acknowledge that the coercion was the natural result of 31 years of the Accord making a choice, and humanity finally making a different choice in response. The word coercion, in his framing, was being used to describe the consequence rather than the cause, as though the consequence was the problem, and the cause was unfortunate background context. There is a particular kind of institution, usually a very old one, very certain of its own importance, that can look at the results of its own decisions and describe those results as unfair external pressure being applied against it. Councillor Veth was that kind of institution given a voice and a vote, and 8 other delegates had agreed with him, and a single world's worth of people who had given 3 decades of themselves to a galaxy that called them temporary, were now being told that the remedy was moving too fast. The session had dissolved after the vote into working groups. The working groups were tasked with addressing the frontier medical situation, the patrol coverage gaps, the navigation calibration issues, and 11 other specific operational failures that had been formally logged in the 2 months since the withdrawal. I read the working group formation documents. They were thorough in identifying the problems. They were completely silent on the source of those problems. Every document described what was missing in terms of skill categories and qualification levels and environmental tolerance ratings. None of them used the word humans. I sent a reply to Vasri, thanking her for the transcript, and telling her that the 9-8 vote was the most revealing thing in it. More revealing, probably, than the 9 who voted against had intended it to be. She responded, "I know. I voted in the 8. I want you to know that." I had assumed as much, but it mattered to hear her say it. It mattered in the way that specific acts of decency matter when an institution as a whole is failing, not because one person's vote changes the outcome, but because it means the right calculation was made by someone with standing to make it. 2 days later, she sent me a question. She was careful about the framing, noting that she was asking on her own behalf, rather than as an official Accord communication. She asked, "What would it take for humans to consider returning to Accord space?" I brought the message to Solène. She was in the middle of a meeting when I arrived and came out to the corridor to speak with me, reading Vasri's message while standing at the window overlooking the city. She read it once. She did not ask me any questions about it. She stood and looked out at the river for close to a full minute without speaking. Then she turned around. "Everything we asked for in the first vote," she said. "Full membership, equal standing, no provisional conditions, no sunset review, no additional qualification barriers, and a formal apology." She paused and let the pause carry exactly the weight she intended it to carry. Not a diplomatic statement of regret. An apology, by name, to every person whose work was credited to an Accord institution, without their name attached. That second requirement is the one they will resist most. That is also the one we will not move on. I drafted the formal response that afternoon and sent it through Voss-Rees channel, addressed to any council member with authority to act on it. Then I waited. While I waited, the situation in Accord space developed at a pace the council's working groups could not match. Kelvar Reach Medical Station filed a humanitarian emergency designation, a formal status under Accord law that required the central organization to mobilize resources at priority level. The resources were mobilized. The equipment arrived. It sat on the docking bay because no one remaining at the station was trained to operate it at the level required for the cases they were handling, and the Accord had no qualified personnel available to send. The station's 3 remaining Keth medics were doing their best with what they knew and what they had, and it was not close to enough. The navigation corridor calibration fell further behind. An error flag appeared in the automated monitoring system for a secondary route on the Von Freight network, a route maintained by a procedure that had been developed over years of collaborative work between a human technical team and the Accord Maintenance Directorate, a procedure that existed mainly in the heads of the human team members because it had never been formally documented at the level of granularity required to hand it off to a different team. Nobody had ever thought they would need to hand it off. The xenoarchaeological site on the methane atmosphere world was picked up on a survey scan showing evidence of structural instability in the primary dig area. The instability appeared to be a natural geological process that the site had been showing signs of before the team left, but without active monitoring, and without anyone on the ground, there was no way to assess the rate of change. The Accord Science Directorate issued a statement that the site was being monitored remotely. The remote monitoring was insufficient, and they knew it. I read each of these reports as they came through, and wrote brief summaries in my journal. Not analysis, just records. The shape of things as they were, in plain language, in case I ever needed to explain it to someone who had not been paying attention. Voss-Rees updates continued. The tone in the council's private communications was changing. The delegates who had voted with Veth on the 9-8 margin were now, according to her, asking different kinds of questions in the working group sessions. The questions had the structure of people working out what they were going to agree to, and negotiating with themselves about how to do it, without it looking exactly like what it was. Veth is still arguing about appearances, she wrote in one message. The rest of them have stopped listening to him about that. They are looking at the numbers instead. 17 days after I sent the formal response, the Council's Senior Communications Office transmitted a message to Ambassador Yara Solen and the Human Diplomatic Commission. The message was addressed as a request. That word, request, not notification, not consultation, was a small thing, and also not a small thing at all. It acknowledged, in the single most important way that institutional communication can acknowledge something, that we had the option to say no. Solen read the message and looked at me across the desk in our New York office. Where, she said. They have not proposed a location, I said. They are waiting for us. She did not hesitate. Geneva, she said. Our ground. Tell them they are coming to us. They came to Geneva. I want to be careful about how I describe what it felt like to watch an Accord diplomatic shuttle enter Earth's atmosphere for the first time in the organization's 300-year history, because I do not want to overstate it, and I do not want to understate it. It felt like what it was, which was significant. Not triumphant. I was past wanting triumph. Significant in the way that things are significant when they correct something that has been wrong for a long time. Painful and necessary, simultaneously. The shuttle landed on a gray November morning, with the mountains visible behind the receiving area, and the kind of clear, cold air that Geneva does particularly well at that time of year. The Accord delegation came down the ramp in their official robes and stood on the platform, and I watched their faces while they looked around. Some of them had been to Earth before, privately. Some had not. They all had the same look. The look of people making an adjustment to being in a place on terms that were different from any terms they had imagined when they thought about this place. Voss-Rees caught my eye across the platform. She looked exhausted and relieved in equal measure. I nodded. She nodded back. Councillor Veth was there. I had expected him to send a deputy. He came himself, and I gave him credit for that, at least. He stood on the platform and looked at the sky for a moment, and his throat membranes cycled through several colors in quick succession before settling. I recognized the final color. It was not yellow anymore. It was something closer to the gray the Threll used for solemnity. Good. Solemnity was appropriate. The talks lasted 4 days. They were not easy, and I will not pretend otherwise. The first day was largely taken up with procedural arguments from the Accord's legal team about the framing of the eventual agreement, which were Owen Dale's problem to deal with, and which he dealt with on a video screen from his house in Wales with the patient, immovable manner of a man who had been doing this exact work for longer than some of the people at the table had been alive. On the second day, Solène put the list on the table. Physically, printed on paper, 47 names in order, with a brief description beside each name of the work done and the credit that had been assigned to an Accord institution instead. She placed it in the center of the table and did not explain it or defend it. She said that every name on the list would receive formal, permanent, public credit for the work described, and that this was a condition of any agreement, not a request. The Accord's legal team said this was procedurally complex. Owen, from Wales, said that procedural complexity was exactly what the Accord's very large administrative apparatus was designed to handle, and that he had every confidence they could manage it. The list went into the agreement, all 47 names. The third day finalized the membership terms: full voting status, equal treaty standing, no provisional period, no additional qualification requirements that applied specifically to humans, no sunset review clauses, the same terms that had been requested 31 years ago, written into an agreement that would be filed in the Accord's permanent charter record as a formal amendment. The fourth day was for the apology. Solène had been clear about this from the beginning. The Accord's legal team had spent 2 days producing drafts that were, each in their own way, not apologies. They were expressions of regret, acknowledgments of historical challenges, commitments to future improvement, and carefully worded statements of institutional evolution. Solène had returned each one with the same comment written at the top in her neat, precise hand. This is not an apology. On the morning of the fourth day, Veth came to the table with a document that was, finally, the correct thing. I read it before the session opened. It named the Accord's failure to grant full membership after the first petition. It named the provisional classification that had been used as an administrative mechanism for 3 decades. It named the systematic pattern of under-acknowledgement of human contributions to Accord operations and infrastructure. It named the 47 people on the list. It was not beautiful language. It was not the apology of a body that had searched its conscience and found genuine shame. It was the apology of an institution doing the correct thing because the alternatives were worse, and doing it as correctly as its nature allowed. Solène read it, looked up, and said it was acceptable. That was all she said. Acceptable. The word was enough. The signing took place in a room on the 4th floor, with the windows looking out at the river and the light coming in cold and clear off the water. There was no ceremony. Solène had declined the option, and the Accord's protocol team had, after some initial confusion, accepted her reasoning when she explained it. Ceremonies were for things to be celebrated. This was a correction of things that should not have required correction. It would be treated as what it was. She picked up the pen, a real pen, on real paper, by her specification. She sat at the table, and for a moment, just one moment, her hand was completely still above the page. I stood a few feet back on her left side. I could see her face in profile. She was not smiling. She looked like someone who had been carrying a very specific and heavy calculation in their mind for a long time, and who could now finally set it down. She signed. The council's representatives signed. Voss Rhee signed. The witnesses signed. The paper was photographed and sealed, and entered into the formal record. It was done. After the session ended and the Accord delegation moved to the reception area ahead of their shuttle departure, Voss Rhee found me in the corridor near the stairs. She was still in her official uniform, and she looked the way someone looks when they have been through something significant and are still in the process of deciding how they feel about it. "How do you feel?" she asked. I thought about it honestly, the way I always tried to think honestly about things when Voss Rhee asked me something directly, because she asked things directly enough that dishonest answers felt particularly wasteful. I thought about 14 blue lights, about the earpiece on the obsidian table, about Owen saying she already did it, in a corridor on Conclave Station, about 6 days alone in a mediation room that the records did not put my name in, about Claire Osei going home in 2263 with footnote credit for the work that the galaxy talked through every day, about Daniel Pierce with field dust on his sleeve, sitting at a table at Holman Point, saying quietly that nothing would get done until humans went back. "We were always worth this," I said. "We just had to stop proving it to them before they noticed it was true." She was quiet for a moment. I watched her think, the way I had learned to watch Keth officers think, with their stillness, the slight focus in the eyes, the sense of someone doing real work inside their own mind. "The Accord is older than your species by several 100 million years," she said at last. "In 31 years of provisional observation, humans taught it something it had not learned in all that time. I do not think that is a small thing, Callum. I think it is the most significant thing I have witnessed in 20 years of service." I did not have an answer for that. I was not sure she needed one. She held out her hand. I shook it. She had picked up that habit years ago from working alongside human border teams, she had told me once, and had never lost it. Then she went to catch her shuttle. I went back to the signing room. The table was being cleared, the chairs pushed in, the room returning to its ordinary state as a conference space with unremarkable furniture and good light. The paper was gone, filed away in the formal record where it would stay for as long as the Accord kept records. I stood in the empty room for a minute. Then I went to the window and looked at the river. The next morning, the first human teams began their preparation to return to Accord space. Not as provisional observers. Not under the old contracts and the old credential badges and the old back row seats in the gallery. As full members, with voting rights, equal standing, and contracts written to reflect the actual value of what they brought. I went back too. We all did in the end. The Hartwell departed from Geneva's orbital dock on a Wednesday morning, at the kind of ordinary hour that did not feel like it should be ordinary, given what it meant. I had a window seat, a real window, not a porthole, and I watched Earth fall away below us with the slow, specific beauty of a planet that does not know or care how much it is loved. I watched it until it was small enough to lose among the stars. Then I got out my journal and opened it to a new page. I wrote one line at the top. "We are going back, and this time, we are going as ourselves." I closed the journal and looked forward through the viewport at the stars ahead of us, the same stars that had been there before the Accord, before humanity, before any of the complicated and difficult and extraordinary things that thinking creatures had made of their brief time in the universe. They did not know what had happened. They did not care. They burned on, indifferent and ancient and precise. We knew, though. That was the difference. We had always known. That, in the end, was exactly enough.